Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program two-time Pulitzer award-winning journalist, New Yorker Magazine executive editor for news, David Rohde, on his book, The FBI, In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State. David, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks so much for having me on.
Let's start with the origins, and then we'll move into the use of the term, I guess, deep state. Where do we first hear that term?
It was really not used in the U.S. for decades. It was something that sort of political scientists used to talk about Turkey and Turkey's military blocking democracy in that country. And it wasn't really used during the 2016 campaign either. But it was a Breitbart invoked it in a piece right after Trump won the election, and it basically declared, a great power struggle is underway between President-elect Trump and the deep state.
And when we're talking about it in the context of Turkey, we're talking about an entrenched military. When Breitbart talks about it, it sort of feels like it could be just about anybody.
Yeah, and to be fair, and I should say one of the reasons I wrote this was that there's real suspicion on the left and the right of the government. There's sort of different language, though, that people use. So liberals, I'd say fear the military-industrial complex, that there's a group of generals and sort of big defense firms that endlessly lead the country into war. The term that's used more on the right is the administrative state, and that's a fear of an ever-growing federal government that's sort of relentlessly taking away our rights and invading our personal lives.
On the right, I mean, I don't want to too fine a point about this, but on the right, it feels like it is much more centrally controlled as opposed to the left's perspective on this. The military-industrial complex is, I mean, it's an Eisenhower term, right? I mean, and it's also, I mean, there's been, I think, fairly decent scholarship that in the at the very least, Kennedy got some severe pushback based upon his desire to sort of maybe push forward through the Cold War. But it feels like it's become a much more sort of like directed animal in the Breitbartian version.
Yeah, the piece I referenced was written by Virgil. I'm not sure who that is. It's a pen name. From there, some people, suspect it's Steve Bannon himself. But they talk about, anybody who works for the government. If you're a teacher or a police officer, you're part of the deep state. Any company that gets government contracts are sort of part of the deep state. And Trump, takes the term and sort of weaponizes it and says, there's this deep state that's trying to force me from office. And I try to be fair in the book. Like, it starts out talking about Cold War abuses, the thing you mentioned with Kennedy. There was terrible stuff that the FBI and the CIA were doing on their own. In the Cold War, there was a bunch of reforms in the 70s that the book covers we can talk about. There haven't been as many problems since the 70s of like the CIA and the FBI going rogue. It's been more, presidents using the agencies in questionable ways. But Trump is the first president to sort of state a coup, is being carried out against me by government officials. It's really unprecedented how he's used the term.
I was also really fascinated by the story of the guy that you spoke to who coined the term. I think you said back in 2007. He was invited on InfoWars. Tell that story, because to me that is fascinating, because I've spent a decent amount of time over the course of my radio career talking about Alex Jones and hypothesizing, sort of like what his function is. And then in many respects, if he wasn't, if he didn't exist, that the CIA would create him for this reason. in many respects. So we just tell that story.
Sure. And then this is again this thing where there's again fear on the left and the right. So the first person that I could find who applied the term deep state to the U.S. was a University of California Berkeley professor. His name is Peter Dale Scott. I tracked him down and interviewed him, and he invoked the term in a book he wrote in 2007 called The Road to 9/11. Scott's view is sort of a version of the military-industrial complex. He's also afraid of Wall Street and sort of corporate America, and so that there's sort of a alliance there. But it's definitely from a leftist sort of perspective about basically arguing that after 9/11, the military-industrial complex pushed us into all these wars, and he felt they did the same thing during the Cold War. He does go on Jones's far right, radio program, and he finds an audience there. But he told me, Scott, that he's really disappointed with what's happened to the term in recent years. He told me they've vulgarized the term. They made it a less useful term. And that, again, he feels like it's being applied to sort of score political points and attached to virtually anyone who Trump feels is sort of threatening him or questioning him or disagreeing with his public statements.
I mean, give me a characterize, because that sort of, I guess, I mean, you've characterized it a little bit, but I'm curious as to a little bit more perspective on that original use of the term, because I think depending on how, I think there is, a series of aligned interests with a lot of those folks, right? Financiers and people who sell weapons and people who use weapons. There's a lot of aligned interests there, and there was certainly enough lined up to support an invasion and occupation of a country that ends up being our longest and arguably least successful, or maybe second least successful war. But it is that perspective is then sort of mystified via Alex Jones into this sort of more shadowy thing that is out there that is really impenetrable, right? Like one seems to be sort of like, from what we could say, like politics, in the sense that you could deal with on a sort of a political level, and then Jones turns it into this thing like Trump does in a way that is, near QAnon or QAnon adjacent.
Yeah, it's much more of a conspiracy, that there's a secret plot by the FBI to, block Trump from winning the election and then discredit him, after he does. And look, every president's come to Washington and been, frustrated. Reagan came in and said he felt the State Department was blocking his desire to implement a policy that's tougher on communism. Barack Obama came in and felt that generals in the Pentagon were leaking possible troop numbers for Afghanistan, publicly, and that kind of boxed him in. But no one has said that there's a secret sort of cabal of FBI and CIA officials, secretly plotting against Trump. There were mistakes made, which we can talk about more, during the 2016 election by the FBI, but I did not find, a plot. The Trump campaign was, Trump Tower was not wiretapped as he claims. The Mueller investigation was not a secret conspiracy to destroy Trump's presidency. In fact, Mueller's finding about collusion helped Trump. So I don't like the term deep state. To me, it's sort of political rhetoric. If you like, government, if you lean left, you'll talk about, quote unquote, good government. If you want to discredit government as a conservative, you use terms like, deep state or the swamp to dismiss it and to discredit any member of the government that you feel, is undermining you or challenging you.
And you go through the church committee, which largely, it seems, came out of, came out of Watergate, in this sort of sense that, and things like COINTELPRO came up out of the abuses by the FBI and the CIA in the 60s. How much of that is, I guess, sort of like how much of that stuff that's true? I mean, to the extent that we got the true story out of the church community commission, how much of that is foundational to this, or is it really just Bannon's attempt to mystify the administrative state, which he said publicly their agenda was to go in. I think he said this at CPAC a couple of months after the election, that he wanted to go in and dismantle the administrative state. How much is based on it sort of a hard foundation, and how much of it is just sort of like the construct is used and then everything else is just sort of backfilled?
There were, terrible things the FBI and CIA did, I think, before these reforms were carried out in the 70s. And I think it's a case of legitimate public fears on the left and the right, being played on and exaggerated for political gain by, Breitbart and the president. And one of the themes, in the book, and I want to talk about, is sort of conspiracy theories and how I think they travel like faster and farther online now than they ever did in the past. And how dangerous they are. I think the pandemic and our kind of inability to agree on, how serious a threat coronavirus is, you had that Trump voter on earlier, shows how if we can't agree on basic facts, we're going to have a really hard time functioning as a democracy. But just a quick anecdote, it is true. The FBI, infiltrated and wiretapped the civil rights movement. They wiretapped Martin Luther King's, hotel room. J. Edgar Hoover, largely acting on his own, tried to discredit Martin Luther King. The FBI also, on the right, investigated the John Birch Society. The main investigator for this investigation, the Church Committee, was a lawyer. I'll just tell one anecdote about him, which plays into the conspiracy theory problem. His name was Fritz Schwartz. His middle initials were AO, so his name is actually FAO Schwartz. He was the grandson of the wealthy New York resident who started the FAO Schwartz toy store. And, Schwartz grew up in Manhattan, went to Harvard, was sort of this member of the Ivy League elite. And he interviewed dozens of CIA officers in 1976 and 1977 about all the crazy things they had done during the Cold War and, plots against foreign leaders. And he found it chilling how effective these CIA officials were at lying. And he also interviewed FBI agents. They tended to be they went to public universities and were more, less elitist. And he was more worried about what the FBI had done because it undermined the functioning of American democracy in and of itself. And it worried him too when he talked to the FBI agents. They rationalized it. They said they had to do this, that, there were fears that Dr. King was a communist and they had to go beyond existing laws to protect the country and its culture and its freedom from, foreign infiltration or communist infiltration. And again, it's conspiracy theories and fear leading to abuses and violence. And I worry about, this dynamic today where, people just leap at these conspiracy theories.
Do you think, I want to get to the conspiracy theory part of it, but do you think that the FBI and the CIA, I mean, that those dynamics, that the CIA were really good at lying and the FBI were sort of really good at at buying into a narrative that they're being told about what represents a danger and doesn't? Do you think that's changed dramatically?
I think it's improved. And I think particularly in the digital age, when these agencies, and particularly the National Security Agency, can collect, staggering amounts of personal information from all of us as we live our lives, increasingly online, we need to guard them really closely. And here's a little boring history about a little spinach for listeners, but after the Church Committee comes out, there's just a raft of reforms that are created. There's a fear of a 40-year reign like J. Edgar Hoover's in the FBI. So under Presidents Ford and Carter, there's a 10-year term limit on how long an FBI director can serve. There's a new court created, the FISA court, which we can talk about more, which, a judge has to approve wiretapping of any Americans by the FBI. The CIA used to, carry out covert actions after just conversations with presidents. There's a new law that says they have to write out covert action findings, which describe in writing what the CIA is going to be doing in a covert action. The president has to sign it. The finding goes to the leaders of both parties in Congress. There's new intelligence committees created in the House in the 70s in both houses of Congress to oversee what's going on. There are inspectors general that Carter creates. Trump has been firing them recently, but to look out for abuses and waste. And independent counsels, they change over the years, are also created in the late 70s, Robert Mueller-like investigations. And all of these things are checks on the FBI and the CIA, abusing American civil rights again, and also checks on president. You mentioned Nixon and Watergate, the president using these powers to sort of attack his political opponents. So it's gotten better. There was Iran-Contra, there's other things we can talk about, but if you look at 9/11, that is George W. Bush, carrying out warrantless mass surveillance. He does not tell these FISA court judges, but that's a president doing it. It's George W. Bush having the CIA carrying out rendition and torture. Again, that's a president taking these actions. It's not the CIA or the NSA doing those things without the president knowing.
So you're not, okay, just to be clear for folks, you're not saying that that makes it necessarily any more justifiable. It just means that these are agencies that are at the very least, there's some measure of accountability that they're subject to, at least within the context of the political leadership of the government, as opposed to what we saw prior to the church committee was these agencies sort of operating rogue and without any type of like political accountability.
Yeah, and I'm a biased journalist. Like, you've got a competition, you've got multiple ways that these agencies are being overseen. So you've got judges who can, declare some kind of surveillance improper. You've got congressional committees where you hope an ambitious young member of the House is going to, attack, FBI or CIA officials that they can, and make a name for themselves if they can find wrongdoing. You've got the press all over this. I don't think there's enough transparency, but the idea is you just don't want the president overseeing these spy agencies. You want all three branches of government and the press and the courts involved to really stay on top of them.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about on the other side with the conspiracy theories. Like it is, and you mentioned that, that we see the implications of this, I think really vividly in the context of a pandemic, right? I mean, this is an event that's sort of built to show, to illustrate like the danger of having societies that are so fractured that there's a significant portion of a society that is so willing to believe in such fantastical things that it makes agreeing on the basic fact of a pandemic difficult. And I think you said pandemic. I think probably what you meant was plandemic. But I mean, this is, this seems to have been, I mean, is this a strategy from your perspective that the Trump administration deploys? Is this a Bannon strategy, or is it real, or does it, or is Trump, I mean, it's largely irrelevant, I think, at least in terms of for the moment and how people react to these things. But I think there is this question of how crazy is Donald Trump as defined by believing stuff that's just simply fantastical. And other people around him are exploiting that for their specific agendas. Or how much is he exploiting that for, like how much awareness is there on his part? I mean, I don't know. At the end of the day, it makes a difference if they're not, spending money on contact tracing and testing. But it is an interesting dynamic. What's your sense of that? And I know you've done, substantial reporting on this.
So, current and former White House officials say that, President Trump, he's a product of the New York real estate world where everybody is kind of, exaggerating a little bit what's going on when they're doing a deal. Everybody's got an angle. And so the president just sort of doesn't buy that the reporters sitting in front of him in the, in the Rose Garden or in the White House briefing room are trying to ask unbiased questions or even present relatively unbiased stories. And I'm not saying any journalist is perfect, but he is inclined to kind of believe these conspiracy theories. He's deeply distrustful of experts. He always was from his days as a developer in New York. And so that leads him to, to discount, the danger of coronavirus, the early warnings he received. There's also a touch of kind of conservative belief that we shouldn't use too much federal government power. An official who recently left the NSC told me that, Trump, just this idea of using federal government power to get masks and ventilators. There was a real belief in the White House that you were much better off using the private sector, and that led to a lot of these chaotic task force and these kind of things. But it's scary in that you have, Tony Fauci, the country's leading infectious disease expert, attacked by Trump supporters as fraudulent, and they talk about a corona coup, and we didn't handle the pandemic well. I mean, our the death rate in Hong Kong and in some other parts of the world, in Israel, was far lower than in the United States. We see this uptick again now. So there's
right. We're still not handling the
this
pandemic well in many respects.
Yeah, and then I'll try to get in my thing about. I think there was an Axios poll that said, and there's bias on the liberal side too. So they asked about what did people think of the death numbers for coronavirus in the U.S. And conservatives, overwhelmingly said they felt that the number was being exaggerated, and then liberals believe that the government numbers were less than they, actually were. So you do have some of this conspiracy stuff going on on the left. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I'm a little biased, but isn't the reason why those, I don't know if they're necessarily on the left, but if they identify on the left, think that the government numbers are undercounted is simply because we had reports from news organizations and scientists who said these are probably undercounted because if you go year over year, March 2020 versus, April 2020 versus April 29. I mean, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just thinking that the number of deaths with coronavirus have not been counted fully because there wasn't a mechanism in which to do so. And there's all these extraneous extra deaths. I guess I'm taking issue with the equivalency of they're both being conspiracy theories. I don't think that the response that we undercounted the COVID deaths is a conspiracy theory as much as it is. There's a lot of reporting and science that suggests that we probably have not counted as many people who died.
I think that's fair, and I would agree that there isn't an equivalence. And part of the book is to kind of say, and Fauci's an easy example, but we need to have kind of career government officials in positions that are apolitical, civil servants who serve, even when, throughout their careers in the federal government, like Fauci, whether the president's Republican or Democrat. And I would just urge people to try to, you can be skeptical of the government, but don't be cynical. But there's no one that comes close to Donald Trump. And whether he believes these conspiracy theories or not, there is a clear political strategy to use conspiracy theories for political gain. You know, he made his name by, you know, spreading the conspiracy theory about Barack Obama not being born in the United States. He has used it effectively to, you know, he's very effective, and as a strategy to it, to discredit power sources and information sources that challenge him. He did that, you know, with Mueller, saying the investigation was a witch hunt. He's done it very effectively with the news media, declaring it fake news. And now it's, you know, he uses it against any government expert that challenges him. And it works. It's spreading. It's changing our politics, and it's really dangerous and destructive.